Welcome to Pagan Perspective. I'm Terry, your Tuesday Subsweek host, and this week's topic is voodoo. Okay, I don't have a lot of time this week, so I'm going to go through each of the questions one by one and hopefully answer pretty quickly. We'll see how that goes. What are your thoughts and opinions on the practices and teachings of voodoo? Simply put, I have a lot of respect for voodoo, and I think that it's a fascinating and beautiful religion. I also have a lot of interest in religions that are related, like Yoruba. Next question. I've noticed within the pagan community, it's almost like a taboo subject. It catches a bad rap just like everything else in paganism, but similar too. It also has a positive influence on its practitioners, so why is it considered the evil twin of other pagan practices? Is it just the way history has portrayed it, or is it really something pagans just don't do? Voodoo definitely has gotten a very bad rap, and I think the thing to realize is that just because someone becomes more aware of the truth about one thing that's gotten a bad rap doesn't mean that they magically suddenly become aware of the truth of everything that's gotten a bad rap. There are people who face prejudices for certain things and yet still hold prejudices towards other things when you would think that would be kind of hypocritical, but it's the way it is. I stumbled across a quote by a voodoo practitioner answering this question, specifically having to do with pagans and their perceptions of voodoo. Here's how it goes. Many pagans bought into the stereotype and identified voodoo with devil worship, dark curses, and drumbeat-driven orgies performed at midnight. They never stopped to think that many of these charges have been leveled against medieval and Renaissance witches, and earlier against Jews and Christians. Some pagans saw the saint images and the Catholic influences and wrote voodoo off as a Christian aberration. Others were appalled by the animal sacrifices and by the fact that Hungans and Mambos, priests and priestesses, charged money for their services. Those who didn't run screaming were likely to follow the lead of Haiti's Catholic clergy and dismiss voodoo as superstition and folly. So yeah, I do think that it's just the history of all of that religious intolerance and racism and fear that has led to all these bad portrayals that a lot of people, including some pagans, have still bought into. That quote I mentioned before is from the Haitian Vodou Handbook, and I will link to it below. You asked if we knew of any resources and mentioned that you don't think that there's a lot of resources out there, but I don't really feel comfortable picking out resources for you because it's not my area of expertise. I haven't read any of the books. I don't know how much you know or what you're looking for, what you're interested in. There actually seems to be a lot of books out there. There's a lot of stuff online. There's all kind of documentaries on YouTube, some of which are terrible and some of which are really interesting. But really, I think with voodoo, it's probably best that you connect with other practitioners and with groups in your area. And you might be surprised by how much there is in your area. In a way, I'm both surprised and unsurprised to find out that there's a lot of pagans out there who have bad attitudes towards voodoo. I've never actually met any that do, and I know that at my local shop it's about a third voodoo, like right next to all the pagan stuff, so... Alright, so for the next question, this person considers themselves pagan but prefers to do hoodoo, and they want to know what category of pagan that makes them, basically. They also included this list of different categories of pagans, which include eclectic, occult, syncretic, folkloric, and reconstructed. First off, I wouldn't say that there's really a solidified system of categorizing pagans at this point. There are some that have started to become that, but at the same time, for the most part, these are all just words that some people use to describe themselves to better communicate what they are to other people and also to help find people of like mind. And that might be something that you're looking for, but there's not really like a pagan sorting hat where you can just put it on and find out what category of pagan you are and what house you get sorted into. I don't know. If you want to know what words or labels or categories I think your practice best fits with based on what I know and what categories and labels I know and use, I would really have to know more about your practice, because just knowing that you do hoodoo doesn't tell me that much, actually. Personally, I would just say that you're a pagan who practices hoodoo. That seems sufficient to me, but based on the categories you provided, I would probably go with folkloric and or eclectic, depending on the details of your practice, but I would need to know more to determine whether you are one or both of those. Then, of course, in this question, the issue of defining paganism comes up, always fun. And then the question comes up of whether hoodoo is pagan and whether it exists in any specific category of paganism. I personally would not consider hoodoo automatically pagan. I think that you can practice hoodoo and be pagan, but you can also practice hoodoo and not be pagan. And really, it depends on what definition you're going by. Obviously, there's the definition that paganism is everything that's not Abrahamic. I know that this is a controversial issue. This is my stance on it. Regardless of its origins, paganism is a term that was used for a long time in a manner that was frankly offensive and indicative of religious intolerance. Is this us versus them attitude, and they're all the same and not any good kind of thing. Personally, I see neo-paganism as a specific movement, or as a family of movements. I see contemporary pagans as people who are a part of that movement, or descended from that movement, or pull from those movements, who pull inspiration from certain kinds of places, and this forms up the pagan community of people who are a part of that group, are accepted as a part of that group, and consider themselves a part of that group. And that last bit of considering themselves a part of that group is a pretty important factor, I think. This group of people, of contemporary pagans who call themselves pagan, are people who have decided to reappropriate the term paganism as something positive and something that they're willing to embrace. The thing about reappropriating a term is that you can't make someone else reappropriate it. Whether you consider it offensive or not doesn't really matter. It's up to them to decide whether they consider that term offensive or not, and whether they want to reappropriate it and identify themselves with it. And if they choose not to, then it's disrespectful to force that on them when they consider it an offensive term. And they have every right to consider it an offensive term because it's been used that way against them forever, right? Personally, I'm willing to recognize the definition of paganism as anything that's not Abrahamic, but I don't consider it useful, I don't use it, and at times I think it can be a little bit insensitive. If I were to encounter someone who is Hindu, for example, I would not go around calling them pagan unless I knew that they were okay with that term, or had reappropriated that term, or considered themselves a part of the pagan community, which happens sometimes. But do you see what I mean? I think we pagans have reappropriated the term for long enough that we don't even see why anyone else would consider it offensive. I know for a fact that there are people who are voodoo practitioners and hoodoo practitioners who do not want to be called pagan, and that is their choice, and I totally respect that. I also know that there are people who practice voodoo and hoodoo who do consider themselves a part of the pagan community, and that's great. And there are pagans who consider themselves pagan for other reasons, who also practice voodoo and hoodoo, and that's also great. So for me, I would say you're pagan and you practice hoodoo. That's my perspective on it. I'm willing to acknowledge other definitions, and I know that my definition is not universal, but that's just what makes the most sense to me, so I hope that was helpful. I know I could have said more, but I will leave it there for now. If you have any further questions or comments, feel free to leave them below, as always. I hope those of you who celebrate it had a lovely Ostara, and I will see you guys next time.